Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Philip Oliver.
I'm Andrew Oliver.
Together we're known as the Oliver Twins, and we've been writing games for
A long time. 30 odd years.
A lot of people know us in the sort of retro community because we did a lot of 8-bit games. But we're still writing games to this day, and we're here to sort of tell you about how things were and how they've evolved throughout the decades. We're going to go through each of the decades, through the 90s, 80s, 90s, the new millennium, and then into the 10s, going through the various different subjects, the games, the business models, the development planning, and then kind of come up with kind of what we learned from each decade, and then at the end, what we've learned overall. We hope to share that with you. We've obviously got a lot of experience. I will just say that obviously everything doesn't neatly fit the decades as well as we would have liked. So it is an evolving pattern, but we've had to sort of put things into the decades. So bear with us. Hopefully this is a good casual overview of the last 35, 40 years of the games industry.
Okay, so games sort of started in the 80s. It certainly did for us because we were early teenagers when things like Pac-Man and Space Invaders started turning up in the arcades. Before then it was all fruit machines and slot machines, but suddenly video games on a TV. And it was really exciting, and it was amazing to be able to control the picture on the TV. Some consoles started to appear, but the ones that we know and have stayed with us, or the names, are very much the Sega and Nintendo came out then, and were very, very popular. But actually, we're from the UK, and in the UK, we had a different scene to a lot of the rest of the world, and that was with these home computers. There was a real hobbyist an enthusiasm push to sell these 8-bit computers that came with type-in listings, that came with BASIC. The magazines were sort of type-in listings, and it was about learning to program these computers. And we were just incredibly enthusiastic, attempting to sort of copy Pac-Man or Space Invaders onto a home computer. You quickly find that BASIC isn't actually that great at doing that, but it was fun. And obviously during the 80s was when we first started publishing our games with our mascot, which was Dizzy.
So initially the industry was kind of split into arcade games that you'd go out to the venue to see, the console games and the computer games. The budgets would be relatively small, sort of less than $20,000, €20,000, and quite small teams. Development times 1 month to 6 months. I mean, we challenged ourselves to make all of our games in a month. Didn't always pull it off, but generally very small time frames. It was very much a hit and miss market. If your game did well, you were being paid on royalties. So if your game did well, and we did particularly well with the Dizzy and the Simulator series with Codemasters, then you can make some good money. But a lot of people, sadly, it was just a hobby, and it could never pay anything more than that. And then, of course, licenses started getting introduced to sort of remove some of the luck and the hit-driven sort of make sure the games got more exposure. One of the first big ones, obviously, was Ghostbusters 1, the movie license, very successful on the Commodore 64. We're actually responsible for doing the Ghostbusters 2 game. Initially, a lot of the licenses actually came from the arcades, those popular games from the arcades.
So let's look at the game development. So there was the arcade console games, and these were the hallowed teams that would be working with the hardware manufacturers like Atari. So I think Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak actually started there at Atari. Whatever happened to them? Anyway, to a smaller, very much smaller area of the UK, computer games were being made, and it was all about working from home. Your parents pay the bills, typically, because this was a time where older teenagers were making the games very often, writing the games, self-finance. You thought you had a good idea, and you're kind of proving to yourself if you could write a copy of a game on something like a Spectrum or a Commodore 64. In the hope that you'd send it to a publisher and get it published. So development tools. pretty much non-existent. When we started talking to people, it was all about drawing your little sprites and stuff on graph paper and then working out the hex codes and typing it in as data. And it was just like, oh my God, this is how you have to create sprites. So whilst we were still at school, we decided one of the first things we could do, and we could still write this in BASIC, was to make a little art package. So we made easy art, and we decided to try and put a lot of effort into it so we could draw the pictures nicely, because that seemed fundamental to these computers. And it just seems weird now that you look back and you just assume that you have tools. We didn't have tools. We created our own tool. We were so proud of our tool, we actually sold the flipping thing. So easy art while we're still at school. And that was so we could do graphics, so we could make games. We weren't particularly into art, as some of our games will show. We weren't that great artists. But we did come up with one novelty, and that was this little device here, whereby we found that people were writing games on the computer, which sort of makes sense. If you're writing a Commodore 64 game, write it on the Commodore 64. But you're writing it in assembler, and if it crashes, you kind of wipe yourself out, and you keep wiping yourself out and resetting. And we had a friend who was kind of looking into a bit of electronics, and we were saying, what we really want is to be able to write on a nice computer. In that case, it was an Amstrad 6128 with a disk drive, and we connected that to the back of a Spectrum, so we could just send code down effectively the printer cable. It didn't matter if the Spectrum kept crashing, but that was a secret of our success, in the fact that we had proper tools and even a sort of dev environment, and we just did that at home because we couldn't believe that you could write in any other way. So, as I say, people just sort of came up with ideas for games that they thought were cool. It was really good and inventive and creative because it has spawned so many different genres. And the word genres didn't really exist then, apart from maybe car racing or is it a sci-fi game? But you'd end up with lots of different directions because people didn't need to get permission to write anything. Even when licenses were bought, something like a Ghostbusters, we were shown the script of Ghostbusters 2, and we saw the original Ghostbusters, and it was like, right, what can you do with that? How can you make a game out of Ghostbusters 2? And it was like, oh, okay, because it will be marketed heavily and people will go and buy the game. But it was up to us to say, well, what can a Spectrum or something do to sort of complement the film, which frankly was quite difficult. It couldn't do very much because these computers were very limited, typically around 32K of memory. Quite difficult to get a Word document into that nowadays, but you have to make a full game that follows the film. That was the order of the day. Pretty much all the games were sort of 2D. If you're lucky, you might have had scrolling, but we were on the Amstrad and Spectrum, so it was flick screen a lot of the time. So it was trying to work out how to get the best experience, something that was in the essence of the license and actually made some sort of playable game when you could only move tiny sprites around the screen. And that was what video games were for us in the sort of mid-80s. We realized everything was coding in assembler. If any of you tried to code in assembler, it's quite hard, but you're probably thinking of it with Windows tools. We did it with really, really bad text editors. And yeah, we did have the luxury of a disk drive. That was brilliant, but even disk drives would take a little while to load and save, even those tiny files. I do remember, what was it? We had a 20 megabyte hard drive, our first PC. We were blown away with the size of that. I mean, that was just huge.
Nobody would ever fill that up. Okay, so when it came to the actual publishing and the business side of things, the early 80s actually started with sort of type-in listings, and we actually went down to sort of the news agents and into libraries trying to find all the type-in listings. Initially, we found that nobody actually did type-in listings for the Dragon 32, so we ended up having to write our own games for that, and in fact, we sent them in, and our first published work was actually a type-in listing for the Dragon 32 in Computer and Video Games in 1983. But obviously, that was kind of the lower end of the market. What we really wanted to do was get our games published and into boxes and on the shelves, and get sort of adverts in magazines, and that's when we sort of had our lucky break meeting Codemasters. And the first game was sort of Super Robin Hood, and it was great to sort of see a game in all the shops in a cassette box. It wasn't so much fun loading them, obviously. And then obviously as the decade progressed, we went on to using discs, and by the end of the decade, you could quite easily pick up a game box and actually find like 5 or 6 discs in it, which was like getting a bit crazy at that point. But then on the flip side, the consoles were really rising, particularly Nintendo with the NES, and it was just massive in America. But cartridges were really, really expensive to produce. The cost of goods were enormous. The lead times to produce a cartridge from a master date. We were used with discs and cassettes that you master a game, and a week or 2 weeks later, you could actually see it in the shops ridiculously fast. With cartridges, when you mastered it, it was 3 months later until the goods came back into warehouse, and the goods would cost $20 or something, and they have to be sort of retailed out at sort of $30, and the margins were very, very tight. It was very, very high risk, and well, some people got burnt, and some people filled up deserts with old cartridges. So, 80s was all about sort of being self-taught. It was a hobby industry. You had to just go and find what information you could. You had to go and hack the computers yourself, disassemble other people's code to try and find out what could actually work. The only books that we could find told you rudimentary instructions and roughly what they do, but there was no programming techniques. I mean, we actually invented lookup tables ourselves. Turns out other people had done it, but they didn't seem to want to document it. That would have been really helpful, but we found that they were very fast. A huge amount of investment goes into that sort of research, and when you're at school, it's amazing that as many coders came through that era as did, because it was really, really hardcore. And then to actually, having learned all the skills, to actually be able to get your games published, required a great deal of luck. The thing about the games, once you've got them published, is like, are they going to sell or not? And one of the things we found was that everybody was kind of older teenagers writing these games as a hobby. And quite often they were trying to sort of prove a difficult technique, and we call them demo coders, and they weren't thinking about the entertainment. They weren't thinking about the public and the audience. And actually, that's where we were different to most, and that's one of the reasons why we had a great deal of success. We always put the audience first. What would the audience buy? What would make somebody pick this game off the shelf? So the first really big success we had was Super Robin Hood. Well, the Robin Hood is a free license. Everybody kind of knows what Robin Hood is. You're going to play the hero. You're going to be shooting arrows. You're going to be in a sort of a castle environment and stuff. It's kind of going to be fun, and it's an epic and stuff. And we were thinking about what do people want to buy, or that's what we will make. Whereas most people just wanted to make a tech demo to impress themselves and their mates. And then, of course, we discovered that just because you've kind of made this game and you've thought of the right theme and everything, we need to sort of reach the widest possible audience. And we did that in two ways. One, we made sure that we got our games out on as many formats as possible. Once you've done all the effort of the design and the graphics and the code, and you've got a finished game, you were there were so many different machines out there that making it for just one platform was a waste of all of that work. And so we very quickly ported our games from Amstrad across to the Spectrum. We gave our source code across to some coders. They could put it onto the Commodore 64 and then onto the ST and Amiga. In the in the early 90s, we then started putting our games onto the NES cartridges as well, making sure that we could kind of address as many people as possible with our games. And of course, the reason for the globe with the flags on, people don't all speak English. I mean, and thank you very much for hopefully understanding our English. Our languages are ZAT 6502 and a bit of 68,000. He can do C as well, but not me. I was out. I finished there. But we found that we could increase our reach of our games and our audience by actually dropping in French and German, Spanish and Italian, and actually our games got out well across Europe, making all of the effort far more accessible to everybody and more worth it for us. And of course, actually developing the game, coming up with a cross-platform engine really helped speed things up. So what we discovered during the 80s was that you've got to think about the business side pretty much more than the creative. The creative is really important, don't get me wrong, but if you don't get the business side, you don't get the marketing right, then it's all for nothing.
Okay, so let's move into the next decade. So the 90s, and our sort of roundup, was really the big rise in the consoles, completely flattening those 8-bit computers. So Nintendo, Sega, and then mid-90s, PlayStation came in, and we remember going to meetings at the E3s and GDCs with major publishers saying, what are Sony doing coming into this market? They'll never be able to get behind games like Nintendo and Sega, who are software developers, and they've got these cool machines, and they've got the market, they've got the mascots or whatever. But we decided to back the PlayStation because we just saw it as tech. We were quite tech people and saying, but it's got CDs, which don't have all those problems of cartridges, and it's got 3D, and it's so cool. And so we backed the PlayStation, and it did us phenomenally well. And some of those publishers who decided not to back PlayStation subsequently went bankrupt. But it did. Everything went up in cost. I mean, all games now were kind of bigger than $30, €30, whereas before there had been that hobbyist market where all the publishers just put games out where at whatever price they like. So a lot of ours went out at budget, $2.99, $4.99. A lot of games, probably the majority of games, were $9.99. But not with console. Prices went up, games got big, and at least they had the capability of providing a big entertainment experience that justified their price. So all the games kind of were now in 3D. The production values, again, that they demanded a lot of money to have a team that could create these 3D worlds that immersed you into the game so much more than 2D ever could. And it opened it up to the mass market. I mean, everyone was excited by video games. Before, in the 80s, when we were on home computers, we were just geeks and nerds, and everyone was a bit sort of weird when you say you did computer games, and people often said it's a passing fad. But no, the consoles made it an absolute mainstay of entertainment, and it was surely never going to go away.
But unfortunately, that did mean there's little room for indies. I mean, these production qualities had just gone through the roof. You couldn't kind of make these games on the PlayStation with sort of less than 5 people. You need small teams, like sort of 5 to 15 people. You needed to sort of get some offices. Budgets, well, they were way over $20,000 now. In fact, they were approaching sort of $1 million quite often. And dev times, you couldn't do anything less than 6 months. I mean, typical dev times were 6 to 18 months. And that was at the point where we decided we would either individually have to join a team or make our own team. Now, we'd had a lot of success off the back of sort of the Codemaster Games and Dizzy, so we decided that we would actually form our own company, and that was Interactive Studios, which was then later rebranded to Blitz Games. But that's a decision that every individual had to make themselves as to sort of joining a team, and really there was no space for carrying on going alone. Many small studios started back then, and they grew from sort of 10 to 100 people. That was when you had sort of multiple teams to sort of balance the work off. Everything had to be a lot more structured with the sort of the discipline of who was responsible for what and what the schedules were, and everybody now had to be salaried. Maybe bonuses in some companies if the games were successful, but everything changed to salaries.
Yeah, so it got serious business. We now had proper dev kits supplied by Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation. It was brilliant that they gave you all these tools and all these libraries, but that did come at a cost, and that's probably one of the things that sort of knocked out all the indie scenes, because before you can start, you needed to buy a dev kit. You needed to become fully licensed or whatever, and you couldn't do this stuff without that permission, as it were. But everything got very structured. You could have good, solid teams. You've got these libraries that would help you use the controllers and the disk drives and the audio and rudimentary graphics libraries, all in C and C++. And you could make proper games in a very structured way. And it was the start for us to see of the middleware sort of market, where some people would just set up companies specifically to do a good graphics engine, Renderware being the obvious one at the time that lots of people were jumping onto. But there were lots of other side sort of libraries that were coming on. I've used Bing as a sort of the video library, but people were starting to just say, this is my piece, and then you were starting to sort of piece games together. And you had to, because these big 3D games were some sort of epic experience that needed large teams of collaboration. So at the start of the 90s, it was the dev teams were deciding what to make. But by the end of the 90s, it was very much all dev teams had managers and producers and game directors, and quite often a subcontractor manager.
and the meetings of what were to be made were made in the boardroom. Those decisions. The publishing was all now on discs at the beginning, but then quickly on to CDs, and obviously cartridges were still there, especially with Nintendo. But the mid-90s saw a real kick in the industry, sort of really ramping up to the next level as PlayStation was launched, and they did some amazing mainstream advertising to make games cool. We've got an interesting young Sarah Cox here. I met her a couple of weeks ago. She mashed jelly in my head for some reason, but you'll see that on telly soon. But anyway, this was everybody had to go through the hardware manufacturers for approving your game, licensing your game, manufacturing your game, setting the price of your game. It was very, very much controlled pricing and sales models. And some genres just got completely priced out of the market. You couldn't do 2D games on a PlayStation and puzzle games and stuff like that, which was a great shame. Later they'd come back to it. It's okay. But the lessons from the 90s, well, we found that it was all about sort of finding good people, motivating good people, structuring teams, making sure that everybody worked collaboratively together for a common goal and a common schedule. That was the important thing. But we did actually discover that that's actually a lot more fun making a game as a team, and the games you can create are so much more awesome. When it was just me and Andrew sitting in a bedroom, it was pretty solitary. He can't tell me many news stories that I don't already know, because I was there for most of them, me and his twin. So when you've got a team of people, it's a lot more fun, and the games you can create are a lot better, but you've got to keep everybody working collaboratively together. And the opportunity was absolutely massive now. Video games were actually becoming a cultural phenomenon. We've got obviously the birth of sort of Lara Croft here, making sort of the front page of sort of magazines like The Face. But the business side, I mean, these games were getting expensive. The money needing to be invested was serious. The inventory costs were serious. You had to make sure you sold a lot of games to make that money back. Because it was all becoming more structured, because games were being accepted as a popular entertainment medium, universities were starting courses, training people in the skills required. But developers were now controlled. We were controlled by the publishers, and actually the publishers were largely controlled by the platform holders. So unfortunately, some of the creativity did get a little bit sapped out of the games that could be made and financed. And there was an enormous amount of effort had to go into sort of project management, documentation, planning, endless meetings, and justifying of the costs and the schedules. But it had to be.
You loved it.
Oh, I didn't.
Okay, so going on into the new millennium, Sony had dominated the late 90s with the PlayStation 1, phenomenally successful. And so now we end up with Microsoft joining the race with the Xbox, which was a very cool machine. In fact, we wrote the very first game on the Xbox, the very first game to master, which was Fusion Frenzy. I believe things like Halo may have outsold us, but we liked Fusion Frenzy. Anyway, sadly, Sega had struggled with its Dreamcast, and now it just turned into a publisher. So times change, but it was Nintendo that surprised everyone, because whilst it was having great success on the handheld market, it had struggled a bit with the Nintendo 64, and people were starting to write Nintendo off. That's not the first, and it won't be the last time. But the Wii, I mean, it was just phenomenally successful. And here's something where you look at the tech spec, as we did, because we're techies, and thinking, well, this is a little bit last generation. The sort of, I mean, HDMI and flat screen TVs were out, and this came with these sort of little jacks and stuff, and we're thinking, well, this is a bit weird, but it had a novelty, and that was the Wiimote, the sort of little wand type thing, and suddenly you could really play tennis or bowling or whatever, and that just seemed to capture the imagination of the extremely large casual mass market. Opening everything up. And PC had always been there. There were games. I mean, as game developers, we were all playing Doom and Monkey Island and various other games, but they had failed to really get hold of things. And actually the internet, which was now born, just seemed to be the place where people would just pirate games. And so the PC was the obvious thing. So the consoles were very controlled and making sure that piracy did not happen. The PC was like a free-for-all. And thankfully, Valve came along inventing Steam, which was just a platform that sort of avoided all this piracy. And people at the start said, yeah, but you can always get these games. You don't need to go to Steam. And it's like, that's not the point. People don't mind paying for entertainment. They just want it easily and provided. And they do understand there's a proper industry and people have to be paid. And suddenly, Steam becomes a massive success. At first, it just started with all back catalogue things, and the publishers would just go, well, this has been in the shops for 6 months and has been delisted out of the shops, stick it on Steam. But it was like, it became a proper platform where people were developing games saying, I'm making it and I'm putting it on Steam and it will be there. Smartphones, wow. I mean, this is towards the end of the noughties, as it were. I mean, they've just changed everything. I mean, you meet people now who say, no, I'm not a video game. I don't play video games or whatever. And you just look at the apps on their phone and you go, well, clearly there's a set of games that, oh, Candy Crush, does that count? It's like, yeah, and I've met people that just say they don't play games, but they're playing Angry Birds or something. And it's like, they are games. What do you do? You don't play console games. Okay, I kind of accept that. Anyway, but we've seen some massive games. So they've gone in a few different directions. But what you see is the publishers doubling down on these huge teams to make sequels of sequels. But it's nice that the sort of creative end is coming on these mobiles.
So yeah, the budgets have gone up. Ignoring the smartphones for a minute, the consoles and the PC games, the budgets have just gone up again to more than $1 million to make a sort of boxed console game. The games are bigger, deeper, richer, requiring bigger teams, subcontracting all around the world, and lots of specialists as well, and all those libraries. All games have to be commissioned internationally. In the previous decade, we could sort of go to English publishers, the likes of Domark and Codemasters and US Gold, Notion, and now games had to be booked and financed and sold globally, largely controlled out of America or maybe Japan. And the Wii really just opened up the casual market. I mean, people who you never thought would play video games. Our sister managed to buy a Wii Fit, and you had grannies buying Wii Fits. Did you know the Wii Fit? That Wii Fit board sold 22 million units. That is more than all the 8-bit computers put together. It's a scales. It's a scales for a video.
What a peripheral.
Who would have predicted that? But you know what? It really opened up the casual mass market, and the Wii was phenomenally successful. We did a huge number of games. I think we did about 13 games for the Wii.
Yeah, we did.
And then, of course, with all of that success, it was like, what other peripherals can we give them? Well, microphones, cameras, guitars. I mean, guitars was a massive craze. Guitar Hero even had drum kits and everything. So all these different inputs kind of increased the breadth of creativity and the audience that we could address. But obviously, they all cost a lot of money to make all that, all those goods. The inventory costs were going up again, so the risk was going up again. And especially when people return a drum kit to a shop, it's like everybody loses out there. But the publishers have worked out that if they double down on their owned franchises, that they can just make them better and better and better, and they've already got a great market for them. And of course, it was the rise of the online PC games, and I think that's really important because that's kind of going somewhere. Initially, these started as subscription, and we had the RuneScape and World of Warcraft starting the noughties, and we're going to see a lot more of them in the future. And of course, the important thing was the digital stores, removing the cost of inventory completely, removing the shelf space limitation. Massive game changer.
So game development, yes. So now that game engine market had really solidified. We had Unreal that started quite expensive and was just the choice for any console developer. Was why are you not using Unreal? You would be crazy. And I used to have to say, because it's expensive. But then games were expensive, and so that was kind of part of the ticket price to get into the market. Unity came up. They were focused on the low end. I mean, Unity started providing the engine engine for the smartphones, and people loved it because Unreal would never work on those smartphones. Way too powerful an engine. They found their niche and they have worked up well from it. And it's amazing that these incredibly powerful tools have become so cheap now. We even entered that market because we had a studio now of 150 odd people. We had 5 console games, multi-platform games, which were being developed, and we had developed our tools over time to cater for loads of different genres, lots of different platforms. And so we thought this is an interesting market to be in. As we're servicing our own games with a separate team, we don't mind servicing others. So a few games got out there, things like House of the Dead from Sega, and a couple of other games were licensed SplitStack, which was nice to see other people using it remotely and feeding back, because there's nothing worse than just looking at your own stuff and thinking your own stuff's cool without actually having somebody, a paying customer, telling you why it's not cool, and they're thinking they might go to Unreal. And it's like, no, we'll give you those features if that's what you need. Anyway, so subcontracting, it was become commonplace, but what we found is it was going overseas. These games were getting bigger, and so we were having sort of art directors and stuff literally directing art, whereas before we'd had them making the art. But I mean, they might make sort of some piece stylizing or working out the parameters for which the subcontractors would work under. But what happened is all the studios now, the teams were getting pretty big and everyone was specializing. Before you were a programmer, no longer were you a programmer. You had to say what type of programmer: graphics programmer, physics engine programmer, gameplay, UI. All of the sort of roles that we know all started to come out of these bigger teams, and people now had to just be an expert in one and not a jack of all trades. We had some interesting areas. Motion capture was all the rage for a while. Very expensive, but there were so many games which were real people running around, so it cost a lot to animate those people and make them realistic. So lots of people were going after the motion capture, and there were lots of different technologies on how to do it, and it depended whether it was one person or whether we did dead to rights, and that was like fight scenes and stuff, so you need 2 or 3 people fighting in the warehouse with a motion capture kit. So we had to use different rigs and setups, but we did a Wii Fit game, The Biggest Loser, which was all very accurate, slow pace, one person doing yoga. So we did a lot of motion capture. So these interesting areas were coming up. And we did create a lot of games for peripherals, and there was a lot of expertise sort of built up on sort of image analysis. We did some iToy games and stuff, and it was really cool, some of the stuff you could do with that, and kind of a shame it seems to have gone away for now, but these things will maybe come back, I don't know. Online functionality was coming in, so the amount that you could do now that these devices were connected, but people were sort of at the start sort of nervous about connecting devices on the sort of connecting your consoles on the internet. We were doing cross-platform games, and an Xbox won't talk to a PlayStation, and we have all those sort of things. But we probably should have done more online functionality looking back on it. We did things like adding 3D TV support, because I thought it was cool. All the movies were going 3D. Hey, let's see if TVs going 3D. There are TVs, so let's make consoles go through. Support these 3D TVs. So we're quite proud that we sort of proved, and we got the first 3D TV game out there. Got us a Guinness Book of Records for it. Anyway, publishing.
Yeah, so the games were so expensive to produce now that you had to make sure you sold as many copies as possible. The West and Japan and stuff had a good proliferation now of consoles. They were easily adopted, well adopted. So the platform holders were now opening up other markets, which was great because the games could follow in behind and you'd sell a lot more games. Everything as it was being published globally now, massive promotion campaigns covering all media for the sort of big hitting games, and now the internet starts to come and take over, sort of getting a lot of that media spend and advertising as people start sort of deciding, sort of spending more time looking at the internet and seeing those adverts down the side of pages, and so a lot of the marketing campaigns kind of start going online, and then of course you have the digital stores which are really ramping up and starting to sort of change the inventory problem of the industry and the time to market and the shelf space limitations. So those are the lessons that we learned. Well, we very much got typecasters, blitzers. We can do the sort of the licenses for console games, and in fact, that became a little bit of a problem for us. You had to sort of specialize in particular areas, and that was an area that was to sort of be fading quite fast towards the end of the decade. But the good news was that games were being really respected by other industries now, and in fact, I mean, America's Army's shown here. We did some work for the US military as well. Games, the skills that we had and the things that we could do were being looked at by other industries as kind of quite exciting, which was great, and started to expand places that the game developers could now provide their services to. But there were so many developers, because not only had we opened the market up globally to sell to, we'd also opened the market up so that other developers around the world could now compete with us, quite often in lower cost-based countries. So they were coming in sort of pitching games at half the price that we could make them in the UK or across Europe or across in America. So that caused lots of problems. And of course, when the budgets were so huge, publishers were quite tempted by developers coming in from different countries saying they could do them for half the price. DLC was starting to be used to sort of expand the life of games, to sort of stop them being traded. That's something that's kind of disappeared. All those different controller inputs and all that different technology. It was a decade of experimenting with inputs. It was really, really interesting. However, the cost of all that inventory proved to be too expensive, and in fact proved to be a passing fad for a lot of it. Obviously, touch screens won through, and this was obviously towards the end of that decade when sort of all those touch screen games are coming out. So that one definitely won through, but a lot of the others fell by the wayside.
Okay, so entering the tens. Okay,
A little bit quicker.
Yep. Now we've looking at PlayStation 3 to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Obviously, one of those peripherals that we didn't put on the last slide was the Kinect. I mean, the Kinect was seen as very exciting. You are the controller. There is no pressing buttons. It did seem exciting, and it did work for some games, but it did get a bit of a backlash off a lot of gamers just saying, well, frankly, I was happy with the controller. Don't take the controller away from me. And I mean, everyone knows that sort of Microsoft brought out the Xbox One, really trying to push the Kinect as their differentiator. We're going to be different from the PlayStation 4 because the Kinect really worked. As a technology, it did really work. It was a kind of magic, but it's a kind of magic that not all the gamers wanted, which is sad. And obviously Nintendo struggled with the Wii U. It was, again, a peripheral too many, I think. Didn't quite work. But don't write them off. Nintendo Switch is cool. It really works. Those touchscreens, I just love it. And sometimes you do want buttons. Gamers love buttons. Anyway, so we continue to see massive sequels. I mean, we are talking enormous sequels for the Calls of Duties and Assassin's Creed. But we saw the middle market pretty much disappear. So there's an awful lot of games that aren't made anymore that used to be made. So a lot of those sort of Disney type licenses that we made, which is kind of sad. But we've seen a few interesting big surprises. A good one being the example of Minecraft, because there wasn't any approval needed up front. It was write it yourself and publish it yourself on the internet. And the irony is it didn't even go on Steam. I think they tried to go on Steam, but it didn't go on Steam, and it was massively successful. And and it was very creative. And that's what digital distribution allows you to do, is allow that experimentation, which is cool. It's a decade where the digital is overtaking the box games, and smartphones are just everywhere.
So it's a massively globalized market now, and digital distribution means that we can reach everybody on whatever device they've got very quickly, no inventory costs. It's amazing. And this means that all team sizes can now find a market. All of this kind of crazy ideas. It's like there's a niche out there somewhere for your games. So what's interesting is that all the different team sizes that have existed in the previous decades can all coexist together because of digital distribution. All the genres can coexist. when it comes to the licenses, well, only the biggest ones can really survive if they're going to be boxed games on limited shelf space and high price points. But UGC becomes a massive influence in this decade of allowing the gamers to actually create the content for each other. I mean, that's amazing. That's not going away. That is part of the future. We've had the Game to Life toys towards the beginning of the decade. They're running into a few problems now. Who knows? We'll see where that's going. And of course, free to play. It started on the mobiles. It's now gone to the PCs. Free to play is a very exciting way to distribute your game, collect customers, promote your game and everything. But obviously, then that means that you've got to monetize it. So in-app purchasing is the new skill of this decade that's got to be mastered if you want to stay in business and be really successful.
Okay, so teams and studios are getting reputations for certain areas, and that's no bad thing. I mean, you should focus, and pretty much everyone is adopting one or other of these middlewares,
Unless you're doing sequel.
Unless you're doing a sequel, and obviously all of those are just moving on. Yes. Online functionality is everything. Connect your players that they want to be connected, and it brings out such a fuller experience. And I'm going quicker because I'm seeing the time there. But listen to your community. And actually, we used to have to listen to a producer who had good ideas and would push us for extra features. But now you can go on forums, you can listen to your players and make sure you're providing the entertainment they want. And the interesting thing is you can iterate your game constantly because it's live updating. So you can watch what people are doing through the analytics and BI and actually make your game and do A/B testing. And there's so many different tools to make sure your game is actually being really enjoyed, and you get an instant feedback, which is very, very cool. Team sizes, as Philip says, it's like one person can be successful now. They can be an independent, a real independent, but then you are seeing teams of 1,000 people. I don't know what the count is on Assassin's Creed, but I know it's pretty damn big, and I'm sure it's over 1,000. And it's a cool game. Anyway, it is a time where nobody needs permission anymore to write games, and the 90s did have that. So if you want to become an indie developer, it is a cool place to be at the moment, which is great. And Steam Greenlight and Early Access has helped these things happen. The UGC means that even the players are starting to become the creators, and some of those player creators are actually starting to make money because of the way these platforms are being set up, which is a cool, interesting place we find ourselves.
Of course, one of the big changes that's happened this decade is influencers. The likes of your sort of Dan TDM and PewDiePie. Wow, who saw that one coming? Games being promoted by people basically being kind of DJs of games. But it's amazing. It's transformative of what it's done to the industry and how it's made the industry even larger. And they're always looking for the cool, the creative, the indie, the kind of cutting edge, and that gives loads more interesting opportunities for everybody, especially at the lower end. Of course, being featured on the front of digital stores also helps significantly. Talking Apple here, obviously. The Blu-ray and the digital can coexist together. Streaming is great, and it's out there. We can now fund games through crowdfunding. Didn't see that one coming. Internet's enabled indies to be able to sort of fund their own games, which is brilliant from their community. And of course, we've got the sort of games just as a service now, so you can just keep improving your game forever into the future as long as you've got an audience and you keep the audience. So the lessons of this decade are the digital distribution and the smart devices have enabled an incredible diversity. It's opened up everything to everybody, which is brilliant. Times change. We had problems of the sort of the last decade. This decade, the industry's reinvented itself. There's space for everybody. There's space for all these different types of games, and it's pretty awesome. You've got all these different business models sort of out there now. So out of all of this change that's happened because of the digital distribution and the games as a service, there's some amazing opportunities. And we found, I mean, hey, we went out of business in 2012, and we've set back up again, and we're doing spectacularly well now with Sky Saga Infinite Isles. Just never give up. Get straight back up, get straight back out there. It's a really, really exciting time to be in the industry.
We had some final slides, but we also have final seconds. So how are we going to do this? So the business models, we have all different size studios. There's so many help. There's so much help out there, and there's all these digital hubs appearing all over this place. So many cities now have digital hubs where you can become an indie. You can, just like 2 or 3 of you, don't have to work in isolation. You can go and feel like you're in a proper office, but you're making your own game alongside other people who are making their games. And what you find in those digital hubs is 1 or 2 of them will have a hit, and then you can decide if you want to join those teams. And that's a really good thing, that you're going to see sort of new emergence of teams and games, which is really nice that these cities are putting in these digital hubs. And dates with some partnerships. I'm running out of. I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay. So, oh, sorry, was that? Development, teams of all sizes, using incredible tools. I mean, come on. It's like, it's just, there's tools for everything, and you can get games really, really slick to market using these tools in the middlewares. And it's amazing how many APIs are now all free as well. So, I mean, I would look and see what people like Google and stuff will give you for free, because it's amazing. You can build games on top of that stuff. So, we are running out of time, so I'm going to click through.
So on the marketing and distribution, I mean, all the marketing is online now, and those influencers, they're kind of crazy helpful for you. But you've got to make sure you get noticed. You've got to make sure you do something cool that is going to get them talking about you. Talk to your community, interact with your community, find out what they want, and then iterate. Work with them. And it's great that you can sort of get noticed. And in fact, I mean, we've got the Nordic Game Awards tonight, and this is a great place to get noticed too. So if any of you in the audience have actually entered games, good luck.
Yep. Hope you do well. So our closing thoughts, we just decided to pick a few key quotes. So we overestimate the change that will happen in 2 years, but we underestimate the change that will happen in the next 10 years. So think about that, because it's easy to look back at these things, but I mean, smartphones, that was 10 years ago. I mean, they have so changed the world. And we think that AR, like VR, a couple of years ago was just around the corner. It takes some time to get these things going, but they will change the complete perception once they get time to bed in. Change has never happened this fast, and it will never be this slow again. And that's a really interesting point. We always talk about the exponential speed of computers and stuff, but what does that actually mean for us as creators of this entertainment?
Exponential change of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, video games are the entertainment medium of the 21st century. So we are the standard bearers for entertainment, and we can create the entertainment of the future. And it's an exciting time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. And yeah, we went there a couple of minutes over, which I think that means we're probably not going to have time for questions. No, but
I'm sorry.
How generous they are.
We're going to stick around for a little bit, so if people want to talk to us individually, that's cool.
Okay. Hope you find it interesting.
Thank you.